The overthrow of the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko in 1997, what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo has lurched from one crisis to the next. A shaky peace deal that brought a halt to a bloody civil war in 1999, which had claimed the lives of millions of people, allowed for the intervention of the United Nations. It established a mission then known as MONUC, which remains the largest peacekeeping operation in the world, with around 20,000 personnel. It's still in place in the DRC 17 years later. We traveled to the capital Kinshasa to meet South African General Derrick Mgwebi, who, in a significant show of faith by the UN, has been appointed as the officer commanding the entire mission in the DRC. Now called MONUSCO, it includes about 1,400 South African Defence Force members, contributing as part of our foreign policy commitments. They provide aerial support for troops, an engineering corps for infrastructure, and support the Congolese army in fighting armed rebel groups. The general has a significant task on his hands, with at least 9 different rebel groups fighting against the Congolese army and amongst themselves. Were you ever daunted by the challenge? It's such a complex issue. Do you ever find it overwhelming?
Of course, it's quite a challenge. The size of the country itself, where you can put the better part of Western Europe. And also, if you look at the history of the country in terms of the conflict which they find themselves in, the complexity of the situation makes it quite a daunting task.
One of the units under his overall command is headquartered at this compound in Kinshasa. The unit is responsible for coordinating the massive logistical operation to support the entire mission in the DRC. It includes fixing vehicles, loading cargo onto planes, and arranging transport to and from home for the troops. Because the military isn't subject to a civilian police force, one of its biggest responsibilities is organizing an efficient military police presence. But one member on the base feels that his position is the most important, and that is the postmaster.
Actually, this job is very important because it works on a person's morale. Mail boosts your morale. You can go without food, but you need your parcel or your letters to boost your morale.
Lovely. Since the start of the UN mission, Kinshasa has been relatively peaceful. It's the east of the country that remains the most volatile, with several active rebel groups. So in the early hours of the morning, we headed to the city's airport to catch a chartered UN flight.
Over the years, the mission here in Kinshasa has been scaled down substantially, with more efforts focused on Goma, which is called the operational area. And that is where we're heading now.
The trip east took 2 hours. And because we were traveling with SANDF General 𝗀𝗵𝗶𝘀, on landing, we were met with a guard of honor. Just across the waters of Lake Kivu lies Rwanda. Now, in order to understand what in part led to the instability in the DRC, you need to understand what happened over there in 1994. That's when, during a 3-month period that'll be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in Africa's history, close to 1 million people were massacred in the Rwandan genocide. The slaughter triggered a civil war which led to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing into the neighboring DRC. Amongst them were many of the perpetrators of the genocide, and they've maintained a presence there to this day. To fund their operations, they and other more recent rebel groups exploit the area's vast mineral wealth.
This is Goma. It's the main headquarters of MONUSCO in eastern DRC. Back in 2013, it was overrun by a rebel group calling itself M23.
Their march into Goma was met with little resistance. But the rebels thought they could control the city with impunity. They were mistaken. For the first time ever, the UN set up a force to target and neutralize the rebel armies in eastern DRC. M23 was first in their sights. The so-called Force Intervention Brigade, consisting of soldiers from South Africa, Malawi and Tanzania, launched an offensive against the rebels that not only drove them out of Goma, but led to their eventual surrender.
Driving around Goma, it's hard to imagine that at one time, not that long ago, this was effectively the front line. But driving with an escort like this one is a reminder that at times things can still be a little tense.
The headquarters of MONUSCO's air wing in this region is at Goma Airport, where the combat helicopter unit is stationed. Heading up the South African section of the base is helicopter pilot Colonel Abel Naik.
Big responsibility, and I guess a lot of that is on your shoulders.
Yes, it is a big responsibility because having aircraft in the mission area It's vital to the operation. I know it's always said that the Air Force doesn't win wars because it goes about the boots on the ground, but we bring them quite close to winning the war.
Under his command are 18 South African pilots, flight engineers and navigators. One combat helicopter stands out amongst all the others at the base.
The victory against the M23 rebels would almost certainly not have been as decisive were it not for one particular piece of South African military hardware, the now legendary Rooivalk combat support helicopter.
It's known for its ability to provide extremely accurate air support for troops on the ground. We met with 2 crew members who say weather conditions remain their biggest challenge.
You can leave here, it's clear when you come back. It's pouring like nobody's business, especially in the rainy season. So it's very challenging.
And confidence in each other's abilities is paramount.
Trust is vital. So you need to have trust in me, making the correct decisions, ensuring that we're not firing on our own forces, for instance, and I need to trust him handling the aircraft.
The workhorse of the air wing is the Oryx helicopter. It's known for its ability to land where no other troop-carrying helicopter dares to. Besides carrying troops to and from conflict areas, it also picks up rebels who've surrendered. And it performs medical evacuations. One of its pilots is Major 𝗀𝗲𝗏, whose childhood dreams of flying have become a reality.
30 years from the dream to the reality, and it's really not a moment regretted. Some say it's madness, but unless you're here, you're not going to understand it. So yes, 30 years, and this is what we're doing. So we're really, really loving it.
Often forgotten are the people whose job it is to keep the aircraft serviced and able to fly at a moment's notice.
So, Sergeant, when you talk to people around the base, they say that the guys with the most important job are you guys. Is that true?
I would say partly true, but from what I've heard, when we are not around, it tends to get tense outside. So, yes, we can say that we are the most important guys.
Looking after security at the base and responsible for the armed escorts is Sergeant 𝗵𝗶𝘀.
It remains a bit of a touchy subject, but how have the men under your leadership responded to you?
They've responded pretty well. I think everybody has adapted to the fact that we've moved on as a country, whereas you have women in leadership, and I haven't had any problems whatsoever.
Morale at the base appears upbeat, which is perhaps attributable to the leadership style of Colonel Mike.
Discipline remains #1 priority. The members on the unit, when I arrived here, morale was already at a high. Now it's coming closer to the end of the deployment. It's starting to drop a bit. But like I said, I give them their space. I give them their time to de-stress because I believe I get more out of them after they get a chance to relax.
And a high morale is crucial, especially as the mission has now entered another phase. The Force Intervention Brigade has opened up a new front against a group of notorious Islamic rebels, the ADF, who have a reputation of being determined fighters.
So are these battles constant? Are we almost always engaging the rebels?
Well, it's almost an everyday occurrence.
And notably in dense and hostile forest.
To get to where they are, to travel 3 kilometers is almost 3 days' work.
Colonel 𝗀𝗶𝘀 is second in charge of the Force Intervention Brigade and has grown familiar with the ADF's notorious modus operandi.
With the M23, it was a group of soldiers that took over Goma by force, coming as waves, whereas with the ADF, you are dealing with counterinsurgency.
And the dense forest is key to their operations.
The forest is a good cover for them. So if they lose the triangle, then there's little space for them to survive.
The colonel is referring to the infamous Triangle of Death, an area of dense jungle in which the ADF are able to conceal themselves. It's located in the far northern parts of North Kivu Province.
While the headquarters of the operational area is here in Goma, the front line is about an hour's flight north of here, and that is where we're heading now.
This would be the first time a news crew has been allowed into the operational area by the SANDF and UN. Our first stop was a staging point at an airfield just outside the triangle. As we landed, we were greeted by the welcome sight of 2 Rooivalk helicopters. They'd been conducting operations in the area and would be escorting us to the front lines. In the hour that followed, we were given a situation report by Colonel 𝗀𝗫𝗄𝗏. We were told that the area was still volatile, and that in the previous week helicopters had been fired upon. The triangle was worthy of its reputation. So we've been told that we have to wear flak jackets and helmets for the trip to the perimeter bases, and that's because the last attack took place about a week ago, so it is what you might call a little hostile. In the preceding months, the Force Intervention Brigade had steadily driven the ADF rebels further north. As they advanced, they took control of and occupied several rebel camps, and it was to one of these that we were headed. This was the front line. We landed in territory captured from the ADF in a fierce battle 2 months previously. This is Camp Abiolose, surrounded by almost impenetrable jungle. It is the front line against the ADF. A lookout point just across the valley from here was last attacked just 5 days ago. The reason for that attack was that the ADF had lost the position, a hill known as Camp Garlic, 2 weeks previously, and clearly wanted it back. But for now it remains secured and occupied by a contingent of Congolese soldiers. Photographs taken of the camp show bunkers and tunnels used by the rebels as fortifications. And in the thick of the battle for Camp Garlic was none other than General Mgwebi.
There is a need to go out because the understanding of the situation at that level is critical to be able to make the strategies to fight and prosecute the war we are faced with.
One of the hallmarks of the ADF is to attack the civilian population living in the dense forested area in the Triangle, as this is known. Some of the atrocities that they've committed against the local population are quite staggering. And scenes like this are always difficult for our troops to witness.
Well, it's not an easy sight to see people being maimed, heads chopped off, maimed with machetes. Sometimes you find children and women also beaten, axed and stabbed with knives, and it's brutally murdered. The smell of that, and also to look at it, sometimes it affects you psychologically.
With the Rooivalk sweeping overhead, anxious to escort us out of the operational area, we caught up with the men and women of Bravo Company of the 4th South African Infantry Battalion, whose responsibility it is to hold on to this position against the ADF. They and the Congolese army who occupy the other side of the hill live in difficult conditions, surviving on ration packs, a limited supply of water, and constantly fighting off insects. But there was one complaint, which was common amongst all of them.
It's very, very hot.
We were then extracted from the hill. Accompanied by an impressive escort, we headed back to Goma. The journey back provided time for reflection, not only on the contribution of the SANDF to the UN mission, but also on the extraordinary potential of this vast and beautiful country.
We came to the DRC unsure of what we'd find. There is a perception back in South Africa that funding shortfalls have limited the effectiveness of the SANDF. But as far as this mission is concerned, this is a story of South African excellence.
But the DRC is once again on a knife's edge. Elections scheduled for November have been delayed, and there are fears of more instability as a result. So that excellence might soon be tested.